Good morning again. Shannon Penrose, CEO and operating partner of Growing Brilliant. And a little bit about who we are and what we do. We are a live online preschool for children ages 2 to 6. We partner with parents to prepare their child for school through live, small group, teacher led classes. And our approach is quite simple. We are the early learning provider that proves that your child is ready. Today, we have brought together with our partners at Maca Media something that we are very excited about. We're calling this What Actually is Worth Watching, a conversation with a children's media researcher. And here's why. Every single day, I'm talking to parents who are wrestling with the same question. Not how much screen time is too much, but what their child is actually learning when the screen is on. And that is exactly what we're going to dive into today with Dr. Fashina Aladé from Michigan State University. Dr. Aladé, welcome. We are so excited to have you here. Before we jump in, tell our families a little bit about your work at Michigan State and brought you to partner with Maca Media on this.
Great. Thank you so much for the warm welcome, Shannon. I'm really glad to be with you all here this afternoon for me, morning for our friends in California on the West Coast. Yeah, and so here excited today to talk about something I'm very passionate about, which is thinking about how media, digital media especially, right, can be a helpful part of, family lives and be something that contributes to children growing up happily and healthfully. Um, so yes, I have spent my career really learning about the processes of how children learn so that we can apply that understanding of how they learn from screens to create better content. So creating content that's, developmentally appropriate, more educational, that really maximizes the potential of great high quality media, and also, right, how we can think about mitigating where there may be some risks in terms of thinking about screen media use. And so, yes, I have been for, oh boy, certainly over a decade. I could do some math, maybe. Maybe closer to 15 years have been in this children's media space. So way back in the early stages of my career, I was really inspired by the work that Sesame Workshop, the organization that runs Sesame Street, was doing, right? Really, how they designed their content with this idea of we know kids are watching, so how can we make that a better experience? And so I very much think of that as the question that motivates my work. And so I do research sort of asking things like, do children learn better when they're playing on an app versus watching more of a video content? The teaser ending is not really right. It depends on the content and it depends on what type of learning we're interested in. And so some of my work has looked at that. A lot of my work has looked at the importance of characters and how the sort of strong relationships that children have with characters can help maximize the learning benefits that we see. And in addition to my role as an associate professor at Michigan State, I am also the chief research officer with Maca Kids. Maca Kids is building an app. I should say we have built an app that we are in the early stages of that is designed to help parents. We're doing some of that curation work. One of the things that I was hearing from parents often in my research was them coming to me and saying, or we'd be studying, a nice, well-designed show, maybe something from PBS, and parents were saying, "Oh, I wish I could have my kid watching this, but there's so much stuff on YouTube, and I don't really like it. I'm not really comfortable with it, but I'm having a hard time finding the good stuff or helping my child sort of stay on the good stuff." And so I was so excited to learn about Maca because I think they're really filling that need, creating something that helps just take that layer of stress of having to like find the stuff that's appropriate for their kids, and find the content that will actually, benefit or help with some of that cognitive development, social emotional learning, and bringing it in a way that makes it, easy to use and that can be hopefully the go-to sort of streaming platform for families with young children. So I'll pause there, but that's at least a little bit of background on sort of my work, both with and outside of MACA.
Thank you. I want to start with framing that a little bit more with some context, and I'll kind of give an experience of where I'm coming from. I'm on the latter stage and getting ready for the arrival of my first favorite grandchild. So, having children being brought up in the late 80s and the new millennium, we had our battles with TV and video games and screen time, just like, most generations do. But I don't believe we experienced it in the same level of context, in the same worry, because we didn't have so much with technology and devices. And my kids are 5 years apart, so one was not brought up with the device as their third appendage. My younger one was. And so I think it's, looking at it from the phrase educational media, that phrase is getting thrown around constantly, and I'm never really sure if anyone actually knows what it means for a 2-year-old versus a 5-year-old. Can you help us understand what you're actually looking for when you are studying this? We talked about it a bit last week, and it was very eye-opening for me.
Yeah. Yes. And I mean, plus one to what you're saying of like that term, educational media, gets thrown around a lot, right? And I think one of the things that can sort of, stress or overwhelm parents is when you go to open the app store and maybe look for educational, whether it's apps or shows or whatever, right? And there's like thousands and thousands of options, and we don't really, there's no council that's vetting, right, whether people are using that term appropriately or not. And I should say, so there's a long history of that term, and there's been a lot of back and forth. But when I'm thinking of, what is educational media, and more broadly, what is high quality media? Because I also want to say that right at MACA, we don't necessarily believe that everything that's high quality has to be educational, right? We often have positive media experiences that are maybe purely or mostly for entertainment, right? And as long as that's done in an age appropriate way, that's okay too. So let's talk about sort of maybe both of those things, right? When we're thinking about educational media, educational television, typically that's something that is designed with a curriculum in mind, right? It's not an afterthought. It's not, and having worked with a lot of the folks producing content, right? When I see sort of the bar, the gold standard, if you will, is there's a there's a curriculum or a learning framework that's there from the beginning, right? And the story develops around that framework or around that curriculum, as opposed to maybe being, oh, we have this great creative idea. Oh, let's see if we can squeeze something that the kids can learn, right? And so that's one of the main things when I'm thinking about what truly is an educational show, an educational game, et cetera, even if we want to broaden it out to media, is really like, does it have that curriculum, learning framework, learning goals there from the beginning, and ideally it has some, pedagogy expert or content expert, right? That is part of the process from the beginning as well. Now that gets really tricky from the sort of parent, layperson perspective, because of course you don't necessarily have that. Uh, you're not necessarily privy to, right, who all did these folks hire from the production side, when did their curriculum get baked in? So it can be really tricky to see that from the public side. When we and so again, that's part of what MACA is trying to help do, is sort of do some of that vetting. And I'll sort of speak to the other side of when we're thinking about what does high quality content look like, right? So some of that might be educational, some of that might be including, our shows that are teaching literacy and counting skills, and some of that academic content might be teaching that more social emotional content and modeling how to be a good friend and manage feelings and things like that, which is a space that media can be super helpful. Um, and and then we also sort of, want to see it delivered in a way that is going to not be overly cognitively taxing. So sometimes we talk about sort of the stimulation of different shows. Um, we know that developmentally appropriate means paying attention to the pacing, right? How quickly the scene cuts are happening, right? Not overly using, um, you know, bright colors, loud sounds that are not in service of the educational lesson. Um, and so that's the maybe sort of last thing I'll say that really connects both, whether it's educational media specifically or high quality media in general. We want to see that the whatever that sort of educational piece um, is closely connected to the storyline and to the characters, right? And so it's not that characters are over here going about their adventure and then, oh, we cut over here to uh, some counting or some, the alphabet, right? And that as a separate thing. So that's something that's actually a great example of something that might be educational in some sense, but might not be high quality, right? So the high quality piece means that the characters have to use that educational content to get through their adventure, right? It's part of the story arc, it's part of the narrative. And that's something that really is key for high quality content. I don't know if I touched on Shannon, was there something else that you were remembering that I that I didn't get to?
Well, you talked about how you can tell by watching a child's eyes. That to me, that stimulus was, and from the parent lens, when their child is viewing content, where I'm not saying go stare at your child, but what are those things that a parent can do that's allowing them to kind of pay attention to, is my child truly engaged? And that sat with me for a bit. If you could touch on that was very fascinating.
Yeah. Um, well, so one thing I often like to start off by saying is we have this sort of what I think of as the myth of the child turning, or I would hear often like, oh, my kid just turns into a zombie when they're sitting in front of the screen, right? And sometimes that seems to us as adults like a bad thing if we're having trouble pulling their attention. One thing I often want to remind parents of is young children's brains are working really hard to process what they're seeing on screen. So the same way a young kid might be super engrossed in a book and you might have a hard time pulling their attention away, that if they're focusing really hard on what's on screen, even if it's giving that like zombie appearance, right? That's not necessarily a bad thing. We do, um, we as adults have years and years of experience of watching television and seeing media, and our brains just sort of know how to take in some of those, scene cuts and things like that. And we know what it means without having to think about it. But for young kids, there's a lot of mental processing that goes on for them to understand what's happening on screen. Um, and so keeping that in mind, that it's not necessarily that if they're super focused, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Um, that said, parents know their children. I think one of the things that we hear is parents saying, oh, but it's, when it's time to transition and move away from screen time, that's where we're seeing a lot of friction, right? And a lot of parents saying like, that's what's making this really difficult. Um, some of this comes to knowing your individual child, right? For different kids, different things are going to be, more or less stimulating, or, harder to come away from. So another sort of reminder I like to give is you know your child best. You know if a certain show is, really creating tantrums or creating behaviors that you don't want to see later, right? And so, however, whether that's, high quality or not, that your child, the individual kid is bringing a lot to a unique to their viewing experience, right? And we could have 20 young kids, 25-year-olds sitting in a room watching the same show. And even if it's the greatest, most perfectly developed show in the world, across those 20 kids, right? A few of them, there's going to be different levels of learning, there's going to be different levels of engagement. And so much of it does come down to sort of knowing your individual child and what they are responding well to and what they may be having a harder time with. Um, in addition to the individual child, we think about the viewing context also, and I'm getting into this little framework that we use, which is the 3 Cs. Some of you might have heard this. Lisa Guernsey came up with this term a few years ago. in a really nice book about kids growing up with media. And so those three C's are the child, the content, and the context. And so we've talked about how the individual child matters, right? And different kids and where they are and what their tendencies are. All of that is going to matter in terms of a high quality media experience. I think we'll talk more about content, so I'll pause on that one for now. But then context, I do want to also make sure to mention, and that's what's going on around them. Are they watching with a sibling? Are they watching with a parent or a caregiver? Um, which isn't always possible, but of course, to the extent that we can co-view and sit down and watch things together with our child, with our children is great. And even when you can't, um, turning their media experience into a conversation later, right? So even if you need to have them watch a show so that you can make dinner, take a shower, whatever that needs to be, right? You being a healthy parent is the most important thing we can do for raising healthy, happy kids. Um, and but asking them later at the dinner table, tell me about the show that you were watching. What were the characters doing? What was the problem that they had? How did they solve the problem? Right? Those kinds of questions, bringing their on-screen experience into their, real life and into your conversations is another way to really sort of maximize the what can be positive benefits from media. Um, Child context. And then I think I'll let me pause here and see, and I think we'll dive into the content piece a bit more as well.
Yeah, it's from there. If there was a misconception that would
Mm.
be out there, just to kind of bridge this a bit, because we're hearing a little bit on it's okay to have your child sit in front. I love the idea of reeling them back and looking for the conversation piece about what the story was, because you're building that context as well as the content viewing. But if where would be some misconceptions? Because I know it may be some uncomfort there may be some uncomfortability with some parents. What is the thing that most parents believe about how their child will be learning from media that your research is telling you is just not true?
So one of the pieces I'll go back to that sort of um, interactivity, or what does high quality educational content look like? What's I think sometimes we fall into the trap of like easy academics, and we think that's high quality educational content. So if there's ABCs, one, two, threes, 2 plus 2 is 4, and parents said, "Oh yeah, right, that's educational." I can see there's very obviously sort of academic content, and so I think that's I don't know if misconception is the right word, but sort of a trap that I see folks falling into often. Um, and so I think the encouragement from that is to, again, think about, is the educational content, is it woven into the story? Is it something that, sure, maybe your kid can remember it right after the experience, but will they remember it a week later? Those sorts of questions can be helpful in thinking about, is this academic content really presented in a meaningful way? Um, so that's one of those misconceptions. Um, and we talked a little bit about, right, this misconception of, oh no, if I can't pull my kid away from the screen, that's a problem, that it's tricky, right? And it's nuanced. Of course, we want kids to be able to transition, but that if they're focused on the screen while they're watching something, right, that's probably okay. Um, yeah, I think I'll leave it there, but I'll look forward to maybe in Q&As if there are folks that uh, have questions in their mind about, what does educational media mean, or things like that. I would love to hear from the folks on this call.
This is actually a really good time. If we do have any questions in the chat, because I could go all day with Dr. Adelaide, but do not want to be the Miss Greedy Pants here. And so if we do have any questions, this would be a really good time to ask.
Things that you're struggling with, wondering about when it comes to your kids and their media use, screen use, anything like that.
It's your time with Dr. Aladé.
not we can keep talking a little bit more about that content piece as
Yeah.
maybe folks will get inspired.
Do want to kind of come back to the idea of the content with you were talking, and this is where I was so excited to see Maca Media coming through my feed. And that's how Julia Steele and I connected, because there was this idea of this organization looking at content, not just for content's sake, but becoming nutrition for children's learning. And how can that, start becoming that intentional change? Uh, being built around real characters, real story arcs, real heart. From where you're sitting as a researcher, what does that actually do for a young child that background content or passive viewing cannot? And I think that's where we'd really want to talk more and have you frame it on that storytelling element.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. And I think I should have led when you asked the question about common misperceptions, right? What I should have started with is the idea that all screen time is bad, right? I think we are all battling. I am a parent of a 17-month-old, and absolutely hearing, right, that this is uh we have to, of course, we want moderation always, right? But what it can feel like is that screen time is, evil, something we always have to move away from. And by all means, when I say there are some parents who have no problem having a screen-free life, great, right? No problem. But for most of us, that's very challenging because screens are everywhere, because we're all, having to accomplish a lot of things as parents, and juggling a lot of things at the same time. So that's like really probably the number one misconception, I think, is this idea that screen time is evil. And um, to your point, Shannon, about right, thinking about the importance of character-led, rich stories. Narrative is super powerful. We, as a human species, right, this is why we have rich histories of oral storytelling, of books and narrative, right? That the as much technology as we have, not to say that bookstores aren't struggling a little bit, but right, but most of us still have that attachment to a good book and a good story. Um, right. And so that's true in the context of media, and digital media as well, as like a good story um, helps draw people in. It's the way our brains are wired to learn, right? And that's again why, um, if you look, uh, for centuries, history has been passed down through storytelling. Um, our human brains are digest new information in the context of stories and narratives, much more easily than when they're presented in other ways. Um, and so that's where sort of where Maca is really leaning into that um, narrative driven, great stories, great characters that kids connect with, right? And making sure the educational content is woven in and really closely aligned with the stories and the characters. Um, and so I think that's one of the, and I should say, I personally as a researcher, but also we at Maca really believe that is such an important marker of high quality content, and that when our kids' media diets are full of that like rich, closely aligned educational narrative pieces, that's where we should really be seeing some stronger benefit of the media use.
Thank you. And I'm going to kind of put a bow around this now as far as one thing to take home today. Uh,
Mm.
and we've been framing about how we think and how children are watching. And I'm now hearing that a great story, even given through media, can still draw the visualization patterns that happen when you can get lost into a book. And as an educator, I'm like, that's something that's resonating with me, because there are other forms of great ways of content, regardless if it is in a book. And so I very much appreciate that. But now, as a parent, how do we discern that?
Mhm.
You can give us one thing to walk away today that's not a rule, not a limit, but something that we can actually do the next time our children sit down to watch something. What would it be?
Yeah, I think leaning into talking with kids about the characters and about the story, um, especially if it is something that you feel that has some really good educational meat to it, right? There are these days so many great shows designed to teach STEM topics, designed, to teach math and science, and um, the ones that do it best are the ones where the characters are really driving that. And so framing the interaction, instead of what does how do clouds form? I'm just giving a science example that was top of mind, but which certainly you could ask your kid and see if they come away from a story asking that. But asking, what did the characters learn and seeing if that's a way to unpack like what are they taking away from that experience. Um, so I think that's my like hopefully fun challenge that I want to give to folks on this call is to think about the next time your kid watches a show, um, ask them about it afterwards. What did the characters do? What challenges did they have to overcome? How did they fix the problem? And I think that might really give folks sort of a new lens through which to think about what shows are high quality and really are doing their kids a good service.
Thank you very much for that. And I'm actually going to be putting in the chat right now, those of you who have not had an opportunity to view the Maca Media Player, it is in their beta, and there's a link to in the chat that's coming your way. Please give it a try. Those of you who have not joined us at Growing Brilliant, I'm actually going to be putting a promo code in the chat. We have your first week is always complimentary on us, but we're also in this code is going to be providing you half off your first month. And so I'm pushing the send button in the chat now. So please take advantage of these wonderful opportunities. And we would love to open this up for some questions. And I do believe there is a question in the chat from Lisa Hanson. And she's asking, what is the best way to handle younger children watching older sibling shows?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for this, Lisa. I know this is a struggle for a lot of families out there, right? And with the first child, we can be sort of so picky and so particular about what they watch and get exposed to, and then it's harder with subsequent siblings. Um, a realistic tip is to like focus on the harm reduction piece, right? So making sure what your older kid is watching is not um, not modeling any behaviors that you don't want like either of your kids to see. So it might be that the show your older child is watching, maybe the educational content is a little bit over the head of your younger child. Um, that's okay. Hopefully they can do some turn taking and each get to watch some content that's like designed for their age range. Um, but I think to the extent that you can um, think about making sure it's not on the sort of, maybe very high stimulation side, making sure that uh, the pacing still feels like it is, maybe only a little bit ahead for the younger child and not several steps ahead for the younger child. At Mako, we are really trying to find the content that appeals to a wide range of audiences, and that's partially what this sort of story driven, narrative driven focus allows us to do, right? Because great stories tend to be appropriate for wider age ranges, right? Rather than a particular educational lesson that may be specifically for 5-year-olds, for example. Um, and so, I think the trying to the extent possible to have some turn taking going on so that they're each getting a chance to watch some things that are appropriate for them. Um, and yeah, not to lean too heavily into maca, but I definitely would encourage you to give maca a try and see. You might find that some of the content in there, I hope you will find that some of the content in there works really well for keeping both kids engaged. Um, yeah, I hope that gave some tips, but if you want me to elaborate on anything, feel free to follow up. Thanks for the question, Lisa.
It's always a struggle, especially when you have a wide gap. Mine are 5 years apart, and so what's what's good for one is not necessarily good for the other at that stage in their development. But yet you have to really look at two individual or multiple siblings at the same time. Any other questions that we have in the chat? With that, well, Dr. Aladé, I could honestly just speak with you all day. This is just, I get very energized and excited about just the learnings and the work that you're doing. And thank you so much for bringing the research into this room in a way that actually changes how I am thinking about this. I know it will be for every parent in here too. We are going to have a replay available, and we will get that as soon as it is ready. But please, if you haven't yet, download the Maca Player app using the link in the chat. And also for Growing Brilliant, use the code half off for 50% off your first month with us. And we will see you all in class. Again, thank you and wishing you all a wonderful day ahead.
I know we've concluded. Should I try to quickly answer the question that just came through?
Please
Anyone
do.
who wants to stay on. Megan asked about how long approximately screens should be turned off before bedtime. This is one where, unfortunately, there is no hard and fast rule. This comes down to that individual child piece. So I would encourage you to experiment a little bit. Maybe try a week where you're making sure screen time ends an hour before bedtime and see how that does, right? And then depending on what's doable for your life, you could then take another week and experiment with a little bit more, a little bit less, right? And see what works for your child. So the good news is there's no like hard and fast, it must be this certain thing. Some of us, this is an individual thing. Some of us are more susceptible to sort of blue light effects than others. So I wish I had the, just perfect rule to give you, but really, I think if you aren't noticing negative effects, it's probably okay. And I often, the very last thing I'll say uh, is to keep in mind that screen media, right, is just one piece of our whole parenting child development puzzle. And so while we want to give our kids rich, high quality screen time experiences, right, that what matters above and beyond the screen time experience is that caregiver child relationship and all the other wonderful inputs that you're giving them. And so I also like to say, right, don't stress too much about screens because they're just one piece of the puzzle. And I have no doubt that everyone who is on this call or listening in follow-up times, you are doing the best you can. And we hope that we can give you some tools to make things a little bit easier. But definitely, we want you to, parenting is hard enough without the added stress and guilt of worrying about screen time. So let yourself off the hook a little bit, and we hope that this will be at least a little bit helpful for you.
It was a great question and a wonderful way to end. Last call. I would love to see if there's any other questions that we would have. Wonderful. Again, thank you all for joining us, and we will hope to see you all very soon. Have a wonderful day.